The coastal fog rolled through Monterey Bay in the early months of 1979, thick and gray, swallowing the shoreline in a blanket of mist. It was the kind of weather that made the small beach town of Seaside feel isolated from the rest of California, a place where the Pacific Ocean whispered secrets and the salt air carried memories that refused to fade. Nobody knew it then, but that winter would mark the town forever, splitting time into before and after, innocence and horror. Jennifer Marie Carson was 19 years old that February. She had moved to Seaside 6 months earlier from Sacramento, chasing dreams of independence and a fresh start. She worked as a waitress at a diner on Fremont Boulevard, the kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee and locals gathered for breakfast specials. Jennifer was saving money for community college. She wanted to study marine biology. She loved the ocean, spent her days off walking the beach, collecting shells, photographing the waves as they crashed against the rocks. She lived in a small studio apartment above a laundromat on Del Monte Avenue. The rent was cheap and the neighborhood was quiet. Her landlord was an older man named Robert Patterson, a retired postal worker who owned 3 properties in the area. He was friendly in a distant way, always quick to fix a leaky faucet or replace a light bulb. Tenants described him as helpful but never intrusive, the kind of landlord who collected rent on time and otherwise left people alone. On the evening of February 14th, Jennifer finished her shift at the diner around 9. Her coworker, a woman named Linda Torres, remembered Jennifer seemed happy that night. She had received flowers earlier in the day from a boyfriend back in Sacramento, roses delivered to the diner with a card that made her smile. Linda offered Jennifer a ride home, but Jennifer said she preferred to walk. It was only 8 blocks, and she liked the night air. She wrapped her jacket tight against the cold and headed out into the fog. Jennifer never made it home. When she failed to show up for her morning shift the next day, the diner manager called her apartment. No answer. He called again an hour later. Still nothing. By afternoon, Linda Torres drove to Jennifer's building and knocked on her door. Silence. She found the landlord and asked him to check inside. Robert Patterson unlocked the door, and they entered together. The apartment was empty. The bed was made. Nothing seemed disturbed. But Jennifer was gone. Linda called the police. Officers arrived and took statements. They searched the apartment thoroughly, looking for signs of struggle or foul play. Everything appeared normal. Jennifer's purse was missing, which suggested she had it with her when she left work. Her car, an old Honda sedan, was parked in its usual spot behind the building. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. Nobody had. The investigation began in earnest when Jennifer's body was discovered 3 days later. A couple hiking in the hills east of town stumbled across her remains in a drainage culvert about 15 miles from Seaside. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The coroner estimated she had been dead for approximately 72 hours, placing the time of death within hours of when she left work. The cause of death was ligature strangulation. The killer had used some kind of cord or rope, though the murder weapon was never recovered. Detective Raymond Vasquez caught the case. He was 48 years old, a 20-year veteran of the Monterey County Sheriff's Department. He had worked homicides before, but nothing like this. The brutality of the crime, the youth of the victim, the randomness of it all weighed heavily on him. He stood at the crime scene in the cold morning light, watching forensic technicians photograph evidence and collect samples, and he made a silent promise to Jennifer that he would find whoever did this. The evidence collected was both promising and frustrating. Fibers were found on Jennifer's clothing, dark blue synthetic material that did not match anything she owned. There were also traces of motor oil on her shoes and hands, suggesting she had been in or near a vehicle. Most importantly, biological evidence was collected that contained DNA from her attacker. In 1979, DNA analysis was still years away from being a practical investigative tool, but the sample was preserved, cataloged, and stored in the evidence room at the sheriff's office. Detectives interviewed everyone who knew Jennifer: her co-workers at the diner, her ex-boyfriend in Sacramento, her neighbors, her landlord. Everyone had alibis or passed initial scrutiny. Robert Patterson told investigators he had been home alone the night Jennifer disappeared. watching television and doing paperwork. He seemed genuinely concerned about her fate. He allowed officers to search his property without hesitation. Nothing suspicious was found. His vehicle, a white pickup truck, was examined. No blood, no fibers, nothing to connect him to the crime. The case generated significant media attention. Jennifer's photograph appeared in newspapers across the state. Television news programs ran segments about the unsolved murder. Tips poured in, hundreds of them, each one followed up by investigators who worked around the clock. Some callers reported seeing suspicious vehicles near Fremont Boulevard on the night Jennifer disappeared. Others claimed to have seen her with an unknown man. Every lead was pursued, every theory explored. But weeks turned into months, and the investigation stalled. Detective Vasquez refused to let the case go cold. He kept Jennifer's file on his desk. He reviewed witness statements repeatedly, searching for inconsistencies or overlooked details. He drove the route from the diner to her apartment dozens of times, trying to understand what might have happened. Where had the killer intercepted her? How had he subdued her without anyone hearing or seeing anything? Why had he driven her body so far from town to dispose of it? The questions haunted him. By summer, the case was no longer front-page news. The community tried to move forward, though the fear lingered. Women stopped walking alone at night. Parents kept closer watch on their daughters. Seaside had lost its innocence. The ocean still rolled in with the tides, but the fog felt heavier now, more oppressive, as if it carried the weight of unanswered questions. Detective Vasquez was reassigned to other cases, though he continued to work Jennifer's murder whenever time allowed. He attended her memorial service and met her parents, who had driven down from Sacramento. They were devastated, broken by grief. They asked him if he thought the killer would ever be caught. He told them he would never stop trying. It was a promise he intended to keep. Years passed. Detective Vasquez retired in 1994 after 35 years of service. He handed over all his active cases to younger detectives, but he kept a copy of Jennifer Carson's file. He worked it privately in retirement, updating himself on new forensic techniques, hoping that someday science would provide the answers that traditional investigation could not. He attended conferences on DNA analysis and genetic genealogy. He stayed in touch with the crime lab, checking periodically to see if the biological evidence from Jennifer's case could be retested with newer technology. In 2003, the evidence was reanalyzed using modern DNA profiling techniques. A complete genetic profile of the suspect was obtained. It was entered into the National Database, a system that compared crime scene DNA against known offenders. There were no hits. The killer had never been arrested or convicted of a crime that required DNA submission. The profile sat in the database, waiting, hoping for a match that might never come. Detective Vasquez died in 2009. He was 78 years old. At his funeral, his children spoke about his dedication to his work and his inability to forget the victims whose cases went unsolved. They mentioned Jennifer Carson, specifically, the young woman whose photograph their father kept in his study, whose case file he never stopped reviewing. After his death, his family donated his personal investigative notes to the sheriff's department, hoping they might someday prove useful. In 2018, a new investigative tool emerged that would change everything. Forensic genealogy, a technique that used consumer DNA databases to identify suspects through family connections, had successfully solved several high-profile cold cases. The Monterey County Sheriff's Department formed a cold case task force and began reviewing unsolved homicides from previous decades. Jennifer Carson's case was among the first they selected for renewed investigation. Detective Maria Santos, a 36-year-old investigator with extensive training in genetic genealogy, took the lead. She submitted the DNA profile from Jennifer's case to a genealogy database that allowed law enforcement searches. Within weeks, she had results. The DNA matched several individuals in the database, distant relatives of the suspect. Santos began the painstaking work of building family trees, tracing lineages, identifying possible candidates who would have been living in the Monterey area in 1979. The investigation led her to a man named Robert Edward Patterson. He was 79 years old, still living in Seaside, still renting properties in the same neighborhoods where he had operated for decades. Santos felt her pulse quicken as she read through his background.
Patterson had been Jennifer's landlord. He had been interviewed in the original investigation. He had been cleared because there was no evidence connecting him to the crime, but he had never been asked to provide a DNA sample because the technology did not exist at the time. Santos obtained a court order to collect a DNA sample from Patterson. Officers brought him in for questioning under the pretense of following up on an old case. He seemed cooperative, even friendly, showing no sign of concern. When asked if he would provide a DNA sample, he hesitated for the first time. He asked why it was necessary after so many years. Santos explained that they were using new technology to review old evidence. Patterson eventually agreed, saying he wanted to help in any way he could. The DNA sample was rushed to the lab for analysis.
The comparison was conclusive. Robert Patterson's DNA matched the biological evidence recovered from Jennifer Carson's body in 1979. The probability of the match being coincidental was less than 1 in several trillion. After 45 years, the killer had been identified. Patterson was arrested on a Tuesday morning in October. Officers executed a search warrant at his home simultaneously. Inside, they found a collection of items that suggested Jennifer was not his only victim. There were newspaper clippings about unsolved murders and disappearances dating back to the 1970s. There were photographs of women, some identified, others unknown. There was a locked box in his bedroom closet containing jewelry that did not belong to his late wife, each piece potentially a trophy from a victim. The news of the arrest shocked the community of Seaside. Patterson had lived among them for over 50 years. He had been a fixture in the neighborhood, a trusted landlord, a quiet presence at community events. Nobody suspected that behind the facade of normalcy lived a predator who had evaded justice for decades. Former tenants came forward with stories that suddenly took on sinister undertones. A woman recalled how Patterson always seemed to have a key to her apartment and would enter without knocking. Another remembered how he insisted on doing repairs alone, even when she offered to be present. The pattern of control and access had always been there, hidden in plain sight. Detective Santos coordinated with other law enforcement agencies to investigate potential connections between Patterson and other unsolved cases. The jewelry found in his home was photographed and compared against missing person reports. 3 pieces were positively identified as belonging to women who had disappeared from the Monterey area between 1977 and 1985. One woman's remains had been found. The other 2 were never located. Patterson became a suspect in at least 6 additional homicides. The trial began in the spring of 2020. Patterson, now 80 years old, sat in the courtroom with the same calm demeanor he had maintained throughout his life. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: DNA analysis, timeline reconstruction, witness testimony from former tenants and acquaintances. The defense argued that the DNA evidence, while scientifically valid, did not prove Patterson had murdered Jennifer, only that he had been in contact with her. They suggested alternative explanations, none of which withstood scrutiny. The jury deliberated for 4 days. The courthouse was filled with family members of victims, both identified and suspected. Jennifer's parents had both passed away years earlier, but her sister attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row, holding a photograph of Jennifer at 19, forever young, forever smiling. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and anguish. Justice delayed for 45 years, but justice nonetheless. Robert Patterson was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. At his sentencing hearing, he was given the opportunity to speak. He declined. He showed no remorse, no emotion, no acknowledgement of the lives he had destroyed. The judge called him a coward and a predator who had hidden behind a mask of respectability while committing unspeakable acts. The judge said that while the law provided limits on punishment, the memory of his crimes would outlast any sentence the court could impose. Jennifer's sister gave a victim impact statement that left the courtroom in tears. She spoke about the 45 years her family had lived without answers, the holidays marked by absence, the birthdays celebrated in grief. She spoke about her parents dying without knowing who had killed their daughter. She spoke about the relief of finally having truth, even though it came too late for those who needed it most. She thanked Detective Santos and the cold case team for refusing to let Jennifer be forgotten. The case had profound implications beyond the courtroom. It demonstrated the power of forensic genealogy to solve cases that had seemed hopeless. It prompted law enforcement agencies across California to review their cold case files and submit evidence for genetic analysis. It led to changes in how landlord background checks were conducted and how property managers were monitored. It sparked conversations about the importance of preserving evidence even when immediate analysis was not possible, because future technology might provide solutions that current methods could not. Detective Santos became a leading advocate for cold case investigations. She lectured at conferences and trained other investigators in genetic genealogy techniques. She always began her presentations with Jennifer's photograph, that young woman with her whole life ahead of her, whose death had gone unanswered for 45 years. She emphasized that every victim deserved justice, no matter how much time had passed, no matter how impossible the case seemed. The community of Seaside held a memorial for Jennifer Carson in the park overlooking the ocean. Hundreds attended. They planted a tree in her honor and installed a bench with a plaque that read, "In memory of Jennifer Marie Carson, 1959 to 1979, forever remembered." Her sister scattered some of Jennifer's belongings at the beach where she used to walk, returning her spirit to the place she loved. Robert Patterson died in prison 18 months into his sentence. He was 81 years old. The cause of death was listed as natural causes. When the news reached the families of his victims, reactions were mixed. Some felt relief that he was gone. Others felt anger that he had escaped further accountability. Jennifer's sister said she felt nothing, that Patterson's death changed nothing about her loss, that Jennifer was still gone and would never come back. The investigation into Patterson's other suspected crimes continued after his death. Detectives worked to identify the women's jewelry that had been found in his home. They contacted families of missing persons from the 1970s and 80s, offering to compare DNA evidence if remains had been recovered. 3 additional cases were eventually closed, bringing some measure of closure to families who had waited decades for answers. The story of Jennifer Carson became a testament to perseverance, to the importance of never giving up on the pursuit of justice. Detective Vasquez, who made that promise at the crime scene 45 years earlier, did not live to see it fulfilled, but his dedication laid the groundwork for those who followed. His personal notes, donated by his family, provided crucial context that helped Detective Santos understand the case and its history. In a sense, he kept his promise after all. The decades that passed between crime and resolution serve as a reminder of the long shadow that violence casts. For 45 years, a killer walked free while a family mourned. For 45 years, a community lived with unanswered questions. But time, persistence, and science eventually converged to reveal the truth. Jennifer Carson received the justice she deserved. Her name is no longer just a cold case file number. She is remembered as a young woman with dreams and potential, whose life mattered, whose death was not forgotten. The fog still rolls through Monterey Bay, but it no longer carries quite the same weight of mystery. Some questions have finally been answered. Some wounds have finally begun to heal.